When the intake worker at the homeless shelter saw my ID, she stopped breathing for a second, slowly looked me in the eye, and then silently stood up, locked the heavy front door with a deadbolt, and pulled the blinds shut. I was standing there, soaked to the bone, wearing a jacket 3 sizes too big, and I had no idea what was happening until she whispered in a trembling voice, "Is your name Sara Miller? We've been searching for you for 25 years. At that moment, I didn't yet know that my entire life, every betrayal I'd suffered, and every cent that had been stolen from me were just parts of a massive plan. I didn't know that the people I called family were actually my most dangerous enemies. But to understand how I ended up at the Quiet Haven shelter that night, I have to go back 1 month, to when I was still a successful senior strategist at a major marketing firm called Apex. Back then, I thought I had everything a 30-year-old woman could dream of. I had a great office with a view of downtown, a stable 6-figure income, and a husband, Jason Brooks, who I believed was my rock. Jason worked in biomedical logistics, and we spent our evenings talking about our future. A big house in the suburbs, traveling the world and growing old together. My older sister, Olivia, was always with us too. She was the life of the party, charismatic and bright, and I was genuinely happy whenever she stopped by for dinner. I trusted her more than I trusted myself, and I never noticed how she was slowly taking over every corner of my life. Everything started to collapse on an ordinary Tuesday. My boss called me into her office and, with a very strange look on her face, pushed a folder toward me. Inside were invoices and reports showing that I had allegedly transferred massive amounts of client money into several shell companies. My signature was at the bottom of every single page. I looked at those documents and felt my blood turn to ice because I knew for a fact I had never done any of it. I was fired on the spot, my keycard was deactivated, and my corporate phone was wiped. I went home in tears, hoping Jason would help me figure it out, but I found him in the living room with Olivia. They were sitting on our couch drinking wine, and they didn't even flinch when I walked in. Instead of sympathy, I saw a cold indifference in their eyes. Jason simply told me that I had always been too emotional and unstable, and that it would be better for both of them if I just left. It turned out the lease on our apartment had been transferred into his name only a week prior, and all my savings in our joint account were gone. I tried calling my parents, but Olivia had already gotten to them. She painted me as a thief and a drug addict who had started taking pills and lost touch with reality. My mother wouldn't even listen to me. She just said I needed to check into a clinic and stop embarrassing the family. In 1 week, I went from a successful professional to an outcast. I had no job, no home, and no family. My car was repossessed for debts I didn't even know existed, and I ended up on the street with a single suitcase of clothes. For the first few days, I stayed in cheap motels until my cash ran out, but the money disappeared fast. I tried to find a job, but my reputation in the industry was incinerated. No one wanted to hire someone accused of embezzling millions. I started to learn what real invisibility felt like. When you're on the street in dirty clothes, people just walk past, trying not to catch your eye. You stop being a person and become a nuisance in the background of the city. I slept in parks, hid from the rain under diner awnings, and ate whatever I could buy with my last few cents at 24-hour convenience stores. The hunger eventually dulls, but the burning sense of resentment and injustice only grows. I kept replaying Jason's last words and Olivia's smile in my head. I couldn't understand how the people I loved could destroy me so cold-bloodedly. The night I went to the shelter, a severe frost hit the city. My boots were soaked, my fingers were too stiff to move, and I knew that if I didn't find warmth, I wouldn't survive until morning. I walked 4 miles through the snow, using an old map a volunteer had given me. Quiet Haven was an old brick building with peeling paint, but to me it looked like a final sanctuary. I stood in the intake line, clutching my passport, the only thing left that reminded me of who I used to be. When it was my turn, the woman at the desk, Martha, began a routine intake form. She asked for my name, date of birth, and place of birth. I answered, Sara Miller, April 9, 1996, Portland. Martha started typing the data into the computer, and suddenly her fingers froze. She stared at the monitor for a long time, then looked up at me, and I saw pure terror mixed with a kind of awe in her eyes. She didn't explain anything. She just stood up abruptly, walked to the front door, and bolted it. The other people in the lobby started complaining, but she didn't even look at them. Martha went to the windows, lowered the blinds, turned off the main lights, and came back to the desk. She was breathing as hard as if she had just run a marathon. "Sara," she whispered, her hands shaking so violently she had to clench them together under the desk. "Do you understand what just happened? The system just triggered a high-level alert. According to every official document, you died 25 years ago in an explosion at a research facility. But here in my database there is a file flagged find at all costs. We've been looking for you this whole time. You aren't just a homeless woman, Sara. You are the only surviving subject of a program that was never supposed to exist." I sat there, feeling like my heart was stopping. I thought it was some kind of delusion brought on by exhaustion and cold, but the gravity in her voice made me believe her. That night, in that small shelter office under the hum of an old computer, I heard the truth that erased my entire past. It turned out my parents weren't my parents at all, and my enemies were people who knew much more about me than I did. The most terrifying part was the realization that Jason and Olivia hadn't thrown me onto the street for money. They did it to flush me out. And now that I had been found, the people who wanted me dead were already on their way. Martha didn't say anything for a long time after that. She just sat there, her breath hitching every few seconds, while I stared at the closed door and wondered if I was about to be arrested or killed. The radiator in the corner was clanking, a rhythmic, metallic sound that felt like it was hammering directly into my skull. She finally reached into a locked bottom drawer and pulled out a thick, weathered manila folder. It had a red classified stamp on the corner. The ink faded to a dull brownish orange. When she slid it across the desk toward me, her fingers were still shaking so hard that the paper crinkled. I opened it, and the first thing I saw was a photograph of a 3-year-old girl. She had the same dark, deep-set eyes I see in the mirror every morning. But what made the air leave my lungs was the small crescent-shaped birthmark on her left shoulder. My mother, the woman I had called Mom for 30 years, had always told me I was born with it. "A kiss from an angel," she used to say. Seeing it documented in a government-coded file made the room start to spin. I started flipping through the pages, and my vision blurred as I read the words Lydia Cross at the top of a medical chart. There were lists of blood types, heart rates, and chemical compounds I couldn't even pronounce. But the most devastating part was a document titled Custody and Monitoring Agreement. It was signed by David and Margaret Miller, the people I thought were my parents. It wasn't a birth certificate or an adoption paper. It was a contract. They had been paid a monthly stipend of $4,000, increasing every year, to keep me contained and oblivious in a controlled environment. Every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every time my father walked me down the aisle at my wedding, it was all a paid performance. I thought about the way David used to look at me, with a kind of distant, professional coldness that I had always mistaken for stoicism. Now I realized it was the look of a man watching a biological asset he was hired to guard. The realization that my entire existence was a lie felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. I looked at the dates in the file and realized the monitoring reports stopped exactly 1 month ago. That was the same week my world started to end. It wasn't a coincidence that Jason met me, married me, and then systematically dismantled my life. I started thinking back to our first date at that coffee shop near the park. He had been so charming, so interested in my medical history and my family background. He had asked so many questions about my childhood in Portland, and I had answered them all with a smile, thinking I had found the love of my life. Now, looking at the technical logs in this folder, I saw the name of the company Jason actually worked for, Aegis Biosystems. They weren't just a logistics firm. They were the successor to the lab that had lost me 25 years ago. Everything about the last month started to make a sick kind of sense. The way Olivia, my sister, had suddenly moved into the apartment next to ours 2 years ago. The way she was always helping with my mail or offering to take me to doctor appointments. She wasn't my sister. She was likely another operative, an older subject, or a handler placed there to ensure I didn't stray too far from the path they had set for me. When they decided it was time to bring me back in, they didn't just ask me to come. They chose to destroy me first. They took my job, my money, and my reputation to make me desperate. They wanted me to have nowhere else to go but a shelter, where my ID would trigger a silent alarm and bring me right back into their hands. They didn't want a woman with a career and a support system. They wanted a broken, invisible girl who no one would miss if she disappeared from a street corner. Martha leaned forward, her voice a harsh whisper that broke through the buzzing in my ears. She told me that she used to work for the state's Missing Persons Bureau before she retired to run this shelter, and she had seen my name on a restricted watch list for decades. She said she never thought she'd actually see the face of the ghost of Portland in person. She told me that the explosion 25 years ago wasn't an accident. A woman named Dr. Elena Cross, my biological mother, had set the fire herself to stop the project. She had died in the flames to give me a chance to be human, but she hadn't known that the people she trusted to hide me would turn out to be just as greedy as the people she was running from. As Martha talked, I felt a strange, cold numbness spreading from my fingertips up my arms. I wasn't just Sara Miller, the failed marketing strategist. I was a missing piece of property worth more than any amount of money I could imagine. I looked at my hands, which were cracked and red from the winter cold, and wondered what was actually inside my veins that made me so valuable. Martha reached over and gripped my wrist, her eyes darting toward the security feed on her desk. A black SUV had just pulled into the slushy parking lot outside, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin knives. She didn't say anything, but she reached for the phone on her desk and didn't dial 911. She dialed a private number and said only 4 words. "The package is active." The tension in the room was so thick it felt like I was drowning. I realized then that Martha wasn't just a kind stranger. She was part of this too. Everyone in my life, my husband, my sister, my parents, and now the woman who was supposed to be saving me, was tied to the same invisible string. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor, and backed away from the desk. I didn't know who was coming in that SUV, but I knew that if I stayed in this room for another minute, Sara Miller would truly be dead, and whatever Lydia Cross was supposed to be would take her place. I had spent 30 years living a lie, and in the last month I had lost everything. But as I looked at the back exit of the shelter, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was the only one who knew where I was going. I didn't wait for Martha to explain who she had called, or what she meant by the package. My survival instinct, which had been sharpened by 3 weeks of sleeping with one eye open on the streets, took over before my brain could even process the betrayal. I lunged for the manila folder on the desk, grabbing the documents that proved my life was a lie, and scrambled toward the back exit just as the front door of the shelter was opened from the outside. I expected the police or some faceless government agents, but when I looked back over my shoulder I saw something much worse. I saw Jason. He wasn't wearing the soft cashmere sweaters I used to buy him for his birthday. He was in a sharp, expensive tactical jacket, looking clean, well-fed, and entirely unbothered by the fact that he had destroyed his wife. Standing right behind him was Olivia, and she wasn't just there as his sister-in-law. She was wearing my favorite emerald necklace, the one our mother had given me for my college graduation, and she was holding a tablet like she was tracking a piece of lost luggage. The sound of the shelter, which had been a low hum of snoring and hushed whispers, suddenly went dead silent. The other homeless residents shrank back into the shadows, sensing the kind of predator-prey energy that usually ends in violence. Jason didn't look at them. He kept his eyes locked on me, and for the first time in 7 years I didn't see a husband. I saw a hunter who was annoyed that his target had managed to stay hidden for so long. He walked into the room with a calm, measured pace, ignoring the smell of bleach and unwashed bodies, while Olivia tapped something on her screen and nodded toward me. Martha stood by the desk, her face devoid of any emotion, looking like she was just waiting for her paycheck. I felt a surge of pure hot rage that momentarily burned through the cold fear. These people hadn't just stolen my money and my job. They had stolen my dignity, my memories, and the very air I breathed, all while pretending to love me. "Sara, stop being difficult," Jason said, his voice as smooth and professional as if we were discussing a marketing budget instead of my kidnapping. "You've had your little month of freedom and look at you. You're filthy, you're starving, and you're causing a scene. We've gone through a lot of trouble to keep the Millers quiet and make sure the police didn't actually go looking for you, but my patience is running thin." I backed away until I hit the cold metal of the emergency exit door, clutching the stolen files to my chest. I asked him how he could do this, how he could sleep next to me for years knowing I was just a project to him. He actually laughed, a short dry sound that made my skin crawl. He told me that Sara Miller was never a person. She was an investment, and that Aegis Biosystems had spent millions of dollars on my upkeep over the last quarter-century. He said that the marketing job, the apartment, and even our marriage were just parameters of a long-term behavioral study to see if my biological enhancements would manifest under normal social pressure. Olivia stepped forward then, and the look of smug satisfaction on her face was almost more than I could take. She told me that she was tired of playing the supportive sister to a girl who didn't even realize she was a walking patent. She explained that the money they stole from my accounts wasn't actually mine. It was the dividend for their years of service as my handlers. She told me that our parents, David and Margaret, were already at a secure facility in Virginia, waiting for the reunion so they could collect their final payout and retire. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to my stomach. My entire family tree was just a payroll sheet for a pharmaceutical giant. They weren't fighting over a few $1,000s. They were fighting over the rights to my blood, my cells, and the secrets buried in my DNA that my biological mother had died to protect. The conflict reached a breaking point when Jason pulled out a small silver device, a sedative injector, and told me that we could do this the easy way or the hard way. He said that if I came quietly, they would make sure I had a comfortable room at the facility, but if I kept running, they would have to reclaim the asset by force. At that moment, David's voice came through on Jason's speakerphone, asking if they had secured the girl, yet because the investors were getting restless. Hearing the man I called Dad talk about me like I was a crate of electronics was the final straw. I didn't think. I just grabbed a heavy metal chair from the nearest table and hurled it at the security glass behind Martha's desk. The crash was deafening, and in the confusion and the spray of glass, I kicked the emergency bar on the back door and bolted into the freezing night. I ran into the alleyway, my lungs burning with the icy air, hearing Jason shouting orders behind me. I didn't have a plan, I didn't have a car, and I didn't have a penny to my name, but for the first time in a month the fog of victimhood had lifted. I wasn't just a girl who had been cheated on and fired. I was the only person who could stop a multi-billion-dollar crime. I scrambled over a chain-link fence, tearing my jacket and gashing my arm, but I didn't feel the pain. The tension wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about the fact that they had finally shown their hand, and I realized that in their arrogance, they had left me with the one thing they couldn't control: the truth. As I disappeared into the dark, snow-covered streets of the city, I knew that the next time I saw Jason and Olivia, I wouldn't be the one running. But as the sound of the black SUVs began to echo through the nearby streets, I realized that the hunt had only just begun, and the city I once called home had become a giant cage. I spent the next 48 hours living like a ghost in a city that felt like it was shrinking around me. I found an abandoned storage unit on the edge of the industrial district, a cold corrugated metal box that smelled of rust and old grease. I had no blankets, no heater, and my only source of light was the screen of a cracked burner phone I'd managed to lift from a distracted commuter at the bus station. But the cold didn't seem to bite as hard as it should have. My arm, which had been gashed open by the fence during my escape, wasn't throbbing anymore. When I finally dared to peel back the blood-soaked sleeve of my jacket, I didn't find a wound. I found smooth pink skin where the deep cut had been just 2 days ago. No stitches, no scar, nothing. It was then that I realized Jason wasn't lying. I wasn't a person. I was a miracle of engineering. And that realization made me feel more violated than the theft of my bank account ever could. I spent those hours obsessively reading the documents I'd snatched from the shelter. I needed to understand the Testament Project. Amidst the jargon about telomere extension and accelerated cellular regeneration, I found a series of encrypted memos dated just 3 months ago. These weren't from Aegis Biosystems. They were private communications between Jason and a woman identified only as the architect. As I scrolled through the logs, the air in the storage unit felt like it was turning into lead. Jason hadn't just been monitoring me. He had been reporting on my psychological breaking point. One memo read, "Subject Sara is too stable. The biological triggers are dormant. To activate the regeneration protocols, we need a complete systemic collapse. Recommendation: total isolation, loss of status, and acute emotional trauma." My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. The last month, the firing, the fake embezzlement charges, Jason's affair with Olivia, my parents' rejection, it wasn't just a way to flush me out. It was a clinical procedure. They didn't just want me back. They wanted me broken because they believed that my body's repair functions would only fully kick in if my mind was pushed to the edge of suicide. Every tear I'd shed over the last 30 days, every night I'd spent shivering in an alleyway, had been a calculated data point for Jason and his team. I wasn't a wife. I was a lab rat they were starving to see if it would grow new teeth. But the real blow, the twist that made my world tilt on its axis, was hidden at the very bottom of the file. There was a scanned copy of a death certificate for Elena Cross, my biological mother, dated 1996. But stapled to it was a recent medical payroll from a private clinic in Switzerland. Elena Cross wasn't dead. She hadn't died in a fire to save me. She had faked the explosion to hide from the government, but she hadn't stopped the project. She was the architect. She was the one who had hired Jason. She was the one who had instructed Olivia to play the sister role. My own mother had spent 25 years watching me through a lens, only to decide that her daughter was a failed experiment because I was too happy and too normal. She was the one who ordered the destruction of my life because she wanted to see her creation finally work. I sat in the dark, staring at the pink skin on my arm, feeling a terrifying mix of grief and power. I realized then that I had a choice. I could follow the instructions at the end of the file, which gave a location for a final extraction point, at a private airfield. I could go there, surrender to the mother who had tortured me from afar, and live a life of pampered captivity as a medical marvel. Or I could use the information I had to burn the whole thing down. But there was a catch. A moral dilemma that Jason had left in a voice memo I found on the phone's cloud storage. He said that my blood carried the only successful strain of a cure for a rare genetic heart defect. The same defect that Olivia was currently dying from. That was why Olivia was so desperate. That was why she had been so cruel. She wasn't just a handler. She was a patient waiting for a transplant that only I could provide. If I destroyed the data, Olivia would be dead within weeks. The sister who had stolen my husband and my home was only doing it because she was terrified of her own heart stopping. I stood there in the freezing storage unit, clutching the files, knowing that the people who had destroyed me were now entirely at my mercy. I could be the angel of healing my mother designed me to be. Or I could be the monster their cruelty had finally created. The dilemma was eating me alive. If I helped them, I was validating their torture. If I let Olivia die, I was becoming the killer they thought I was. As the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, I realized I had less than an hour to decide. The month was almost over, and the final act was about to begin. I picked up the burner phone and dialed the only person I knew who might still have a shred of a soul left. I called David Miller, the man I used to call Dad. When he answered, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just said, "Tell Elena I'm coming for her. And tell Jason to bring the emerald necklace. I want it back before I finish this." I walked into that private hangar at 3 a.m. The air was 40 degrees, smelling of jet fuel and wet concrete. My breath was a steady mist in front of me. The only thing about me that felt normal. Jason was there, standing next to a sleek black Gulfstream jet, looking like he'd finally won the lottery. Beside him was Olivia in a wheelchair, her skin the color of old paper, her breathing shallow and mechanical. And then there was the woman standing in the center of the lights. Elena Cross. She looked exactly like the woman in the file, just older. Her face a mask of surgical precision and cold intellectual curiosity. She didn't run to me. She didn't cry. She just looked at my arm, the one that had healed in 48 hours, and nodded. "The stress test worked," she said, her voice sounding like a recording. "Welcome home, Lydia." I didn't call her mom. I didn't even look at Jason. I walked straight up to Elena and held out the burner phone. I told her that I had already sent the entire testament database, including the payrolls for David and Margaret and the logs of the psychological torture they'd put me through, to 3 different federal agencies and 2 major news outlets. The look of triumph on Jason's face vanished instantly, replaced by a gray, sickly fear. Elena, however, didn't flinch. She told me that the government would never prosecute her because she was giving them the key to immortality. She said that once she had my blood, the source code, she would be untouchable. She looked at Olivia, who was clutching the armrests of her wheelchair, and then back at me. "Give us the sample and I'll let you walk away," she promised. "Save your sister, and you can go back to being a ghost." That was the moment I had to decide. I looked at Olivia. She had been my sister for my whole life. She had held my hand when I had the flu. She had helped me pick out my wedding dress. And then she had systematically helped my husband ruin me for a heartbeat that wasn't failing. I thought about the month I'd spent in the dirt, the shame of being invisible, and the way Jason had looked at me when he told me I was just an asset. I realized that if I gave Elena what she wanted, I was just continuing the cycle. I was letting them win. But if I walked away, I was letting a person die regardless of how much I hated her. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a syringe I'd taken from a pharmacy earlier that night. I didn't wait for them to help me. I sat down on a flight crate, tied off my own arm, and drew 3 vials of my own blood. My skin felt tight, and my heart was racing, but I stayed calm. I set the vials on the crate between us. "Here is your cure," I said to Elena. "And here is your legacy." I then held up a small lighter. In my other hand was the original physical folder Martha had given me at the shelter, the only hard copy of the chemical formulas Elena had spent 30 years hiding. Before Jason could move, I dropped the lighter onto the papers. The fire flared up, bright and hot, reflected in the polished metal of the jet. Elena screamed. A sound of pure raw grief for her work, not for me. She scrambled toward the burning papers, trying to save the data with her bare hands, but it was too late. The formulas were gone. All she had left were the 3 vials of blood. I looked at Jason, who was staring at the vials like they were bars of gold. I told him that the data I sent to the feds wasn't just about the project. It was about the millions he'd embezzled from Apex to fund his lifestyle while he thought I was distracted. I told him that by the time that jet took off, his bank accounts would be frozen and there would be a warrant for his arrest in every state. I turned and walked out of the hangar. I didn't stay to see if Elena gave the blood to Olivia. I didn't stay to watch the police arrive. I just walked until the sound of the jet engines faded into the distance. A month later, I was sitting on a bench in a different city, 1,000 miles away. I had a new name, a new face, and a job working in a quiet library where no one asked me about my medical history. I read in the news that Aegis Biosystems had filed for bankruptcy, and that several unnamed executives were being held for human rights violations. There was no mention of Elena Cross. Some people are too powerful to stay in a cage for long. I also heard that Olivia had received a miraculous recovery before disappearing from the public eye. I sometimes look at the crescent birthmark on my shoulder and think about what I am. I'm not Sara Miller anymore, and I'm definitely not Lydia Cross. I'm a woman who was broken into 1,000 pieces and found out that she could put herself back together faster than anyone expected. I wonder if I'll ever age, or if I'll stay 30 forever. A permanent monument to a mother's ambition and a husband's greed. The moral dilemma of that night doesn't keep me awake anymore. I gave them the blood because I'm not like them. I value life, even the lives of those who hurt me. But I burned the formulas because no one should have the power to design a human being. We are supposed to be fragile. We are supposed to be temporary. That's what makes our choices matter. As I watched the sun come up over the lake this morning, I realized that for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't an investment or a project. I was just a woman sitting on a bench, feeling the cold air on my skin, and for now that is more than enough. The month that destroyed my life was the same one that gave it back to me. I'm still invisible, but this time it's because I chose to be. And sometimes the best way to win a game is to burn the board and walk away.